prices are going to go down everywhere where they're really expensive right now,
Right.
and maybe come up in some areas that are really cheap, but not come up beyond the point where someone with a basic income could afford to live there.
Wait, why not? I guess I feel like that would happen probably.
Because the people who are moving to those areas are doing that because they can afford to live there on a basic income.
Oh yeah, but I don't know.
Largely.
Wouldn't some people, like the same way that gentrification happens now, where it's like, oh, like this is like downtown Boston's a little too expensive, right? And
Yeah.
so like Somerville gentrifies, and then like Watertown gentrifies, and then this is kind of like seems like a natural and to some degree beneficial process. But then the problem is for like the people who already live there not feeling like they want to move.
It's a little bit of a different process because it's the force is coming from the other direction instead of so in the process you described, stuff gets too expensive, so that pushes people to other places, and they push people to other places. With basic income, you can imagine we've now created all this land outside, and that pulls people. It pulls people to those places, and then the places they got pulled from get a little bit cheaper, and that pulls people there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's less of a forcing people out, is what I
But
imagine.
why wouldn't the places they're getting pulled to become more expensive? And like, why wouldn't
the places they're getting pulled to are going to get more expensive, but those places ultimately are going to be very cheap places.
Wouldn't it happen at every gradient? Why would it only be like the cheapest places?
Yeah, so it's not going to get more expensive at every gradient because what you're doing is you're allowing people to spread out more. You're giving people more options.
Yeah.
So you'd expect the really expensive areas to get cheaper,
Yeah,
and then the
that,
really cheap areas to get maybe a little bit more expensive. But then there's some area in between where prices just kind of stay the same, where everyone gets a basic income.
People. You got to confront people with that, and you get some uh, knee jerk criticisms like saying, "Oh, so you're against work?" No, I am not against work. I am against forced labor. Being against forced labor is like being against forced sex. I am not against sex if I say I'm against rape. I'm against forced sex. I am not against labor if I say I'm against a mandatory participation economy. I am against forced labor. Forced labor with a choice of masters is better than chattel slavery, but it's still a form of false labor, forced labor, and it's still one that we do by creating this state of manufactured desperation. We manufacture desperation by taking all the resources and saying a few people own these. Government controls some of them, and private, wealthy, big corporations own the rest of them. And you can't touch them unless you survive. And that puts all of us, not just the people at the bottom, but all of us in a state where we are stressed and worried because we have to keep working to keep our needs going. The state of manufactured desperation is not good for any of us. It's only good for
People to move there, but it's not.
businesses and really like to pay low wages.
Um, I assume you're talking about the part where they disagreed over whether or not to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, not that I
Well,
want to dwell on that part too much or anything, but yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I know that's fine. Actually, I mean, because there was so much they talked about in a really productive way, and that too, and I really liked the whole conversation. I was actually just really it was nice to see other people who have been they're like us. They're independent researchers, right? They have their own organization. They're trying to figure out their own model for this stuff, and they were all asking really good questions about like his perspective. That was just nice to see. So that was really cool. The part where they disagreed about that frustrated me a little bit because I think maybe Alex came off like he was saying it kind of maybe sounded like he was saying governments don't create money, or maybe that's how it was interpreted. Whereas it's really sort of more that government borrowing and private sector borrowing both create money, right? So whether you want to frame one as borrowing or not, the important thing is money's being created either way. Because I feel like they agree more than they disagree on that. But certainly, it seemed like that was maybe the one of the bigger points of contention. There were other ones, but that was the one that I think seemed to bother Keane the most. That was my read on it.
Yeah, yeah. He seemed to think that he was basically saying that you couldn't have a basic income that would be high enough to be sufficient for people to live off, right? Like he didn't actually, when we got down to like what is the actual definition of basic income, he didn't really believe that such a thing would be feasible at a high enough rate to be meaningful. Um,
Maybe
right.
so, but I think he did seem to see something interesting about Alex's views about it being an alternative to easy monetary policy for the financial sector. So I think he was getting acclimating. He was asking good questions about like the differences between really what Alex believed, and I thought Alex gave some really good
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, he was still like getting to grips with like some of the basic things Alex was saying, like toward the end of the video, right? Like I don't know that Alex sort of like got all his points across super quickly and efficiently at the start. Like people I mean, the idea that it's about replacing private debt with public debt, like they sort of like hit on that like really near the end of the video.
Yeah. Hey, other Alex, how are you? Welcome. We're just we're starting another stream here to kind of talk about the Steve Keen discussion with Alex and others.
Yeah, hey Derek. Yeah, I was just watching the video. Just got maybe started about a third of the way in. It was pretty interesting. I haven't had a chance to see Alex talk for a while, so that was great.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, I've been meaning to catch up with you, by the way.
Yeah, same here. Phil, I guess I'm not sure if this is other Alex. Actually interviewed him. You remember him from some of the Boston Income, probably. But I actually interviewed him for the documentary clips that I showed you. So it's nice to see you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's more than one Alex in this world.
Oh, I know. Which is actually a little tough for the documentary because I want to introduce you at the right point, so there's not too many Alexes. But
so you guys are still working. You're still working on that?
I have the footage. I have clips of it. I'm thinking about bringing in an external editor to help me kind of shape it. Probably not into a full documentary film at this point. So I'm deciding between whether or not to release it as a sort of short informational piece or whether to keep developing it as a documentary film. So I'm working on it. But as you can see, we've been up to other stuff too. What was your take on that? I assume you watched the Keen Channel show.
Yeah. I was just on the yeah, I think I maybe started about a third of the way in, and it was
And, oh, by the way, since I haven't seen you before, I should let you know. I just started streaming this, so we're actually streaming this on YouTube too. So I thought I should let you know.
Oh, okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Just as audio.
Yeah, just audio.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting discussion, and yeah, it was definitely a different sort of forum that I've seen. It was quite more detailed and clearly, yeah, it was not necessarily sort of necessarily a UBI friendly, I would say, environment, but I thought Alex really put his ideas out there in a really kind of sort of compelling way, and so I thought it was good to, yeah, and also like they ask good questions, and I'm still trying to struggle and understand a lot of this stuff myself. Certainly not a macroeconomist of any sort, but I am interested in the modeling still, and I kind of have talked to Alex about that a little bit in passing, mainly from the agent-based modeling kind of point of view, which is a bit more different to the kind of macroeconomic modeling that I talked about. But yeah, I don't know what was everyone else's thoughts on this.
Well, the modeling stuff, the idea that we need to do more modeling, and also, Keen's sort of points of constructive criticism at the end that we need to do more sort of modeling about how to calibrate it and what it, try to get some numbers on, how it would calibrate or something. That's basically true, but I think the problem is that we're at the stage where like barely anybody recognizes right now that this is a thing that needs to be done. And really, we should have like an army of, PhD grad students working on this sort of thing, like we have in other areas of economics. And so I think, what Alex and us are kind of working on right now is, trying to argue that that we should try and figure out how to calibrate basic income, and that it means something to calibrate basic income, and that there is theoretically such a thing as a natural rate of basic income that we should be trying to find, and that we could be trying to apply some modeling techniques to help do that maybe.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. I sort of feel like I keep coming back to this idea that we're sort of stuck in the paradigm developed by like I think one of the participants said of this kind of system that evolved over time, and that includes the language to describe it, and so a lot of the discussions get mired down in the semantics of it, and we sort of think of interest rates as kind of something as maybe sort of like intrinsic. All these things that are intrinsic are sort of in some sense constructed, and so you could imagine them being constructed in slightly different ways, and sort of going back to kind of like for first principles in a way that don't assume that things work in one way. And I think that's something that is sort of sorely needed, is to kind of come up with a new language, and like you said, the natural rate of interest is sort of like what are these things? What is the sort of how could you design it from scratch, and then ask these sort of questions? And I have a good answer to that, but it feels like that's something that needs to be done.
Well,
yeah, absolutely. Things do sort of like shake out in a certain particular way, and like it's probably because it's really hard to test anything, right? Because you're talking about like the scale of national economies, and we you can't really do like randomized controlled trials or anything with these sort of things. So we kind of just have to do whatever, we have to be conservative most of the time, and so it's really hard to try new things in economics and to test things. And I really wish we could have if we could just find a smaller economy somewhere, and then we can maybe try some kind of calibrated basic income out there in a sort of like a slightly lower risk setting. That'd be really cool. Like a proper laboratory of the states. Maybe Louisiana can have its own basic income or something. I don't know.
Well, the modeling question is interesting, and seeing Keen's company's kind of real emphasis on that. Obviously, they have that software that they take modeling very seriously. And Alex is really working on a different kind of model, right? Like a theoretical model. Like basically, he's trying to create an intellectual framework for understanding the basic principles. Like, what is this lever? What does it do? And the funny thing is, you kind of need a model like that, a causal model, before you can really plug your policy into a more complicated, right, predictive model. Asking the question of like, well, what problem does UBI solve, and like, how does it work, is a really different question from like, can we predict how much UBI is possible right now? And based on this show, I actually think maybe, because in the past I've been sort of like, not dismissive, but maybe skeptical of like coming up with firm answers to that, because, we don't know how much it will calibrate at, right? However, it might be kind of useful if we could come up with modeling ways to model, if you're really specifically trying to answer the question of how much, if you just raise UBI with your deficit spending, how much can you get out of it? If you did have a way to try to model that, that might be very interesting, because even though you couldn't have a lot of confidence on it based on how rapidly markets can change and all of that, if nothing else, it might give you an intuition about, well, how much UBI really is possible. A lot of Steve's objections, right, were that like, hey, if you do this, it's probably going to be so small, it's not even right up to people's basic needs. And it would be interesting if we found a way to model the economy in a way that kind of made sense given our theoretical understanding for what the constraints are. Could we make a rough guess estimate? What could we use as an indicator for that, right? Is there something about the size of the financial sector or the labor market compared to something else that could give us a rough indication of how much it will calibrate at? I don't think those are really useful questions for trying to understand the theory or the justification for the policy.
It's jumping the gun, right?
Yeah, it's jumping the gun, but it could be useful as like, just to have, if people want to debate that, right? How much will it calibrate at? You could forward them.
You can throw some numbers out there. People are always asking me for numbers and data and stuff, know, and like it might help to sort of like get a bit more attention or something, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think if we were actually, if a country decided to do a basic income, then there'd be all kinds of people who are trying to do all these modeling simulations and try to make educated guesses at how far we could afford to raise it in the short term and how it would affect interest rates and stuff. Before that's going to happen, though, somebody has to sort of convince people that this is a thing that we should actually try to do, and that we should try to calibrate it, and that the optimum rate of basic income is not zero. There's some non-zero level of basic income that we should have. which we'd only have to sacrifice low interest rate policy to achieve that. I think that's the main argument we're making, right? That there's some level of basic income we can have, but all we've got to sacrifice is expansionary monetary policy that's driving the credit cycle right now.
I got the impression also that through the discussion that towards the end maybe Steve softened a little bit, and that there was sort of a I think you got the sort of the idea that that what the goal of basic income wasn't like the sort of guaranteed income concept, and that it was what Alex is trying to talk about is something slightly different with it. And I think that's understandable because it took me a long time to figure that out when I first went to the basic income meetings in Boston back in probably like 2018 or something like that. It was sort of like I didn't really kind of I had a very hazy idea. I had pretty much the kind of like the sort of like 10,000 word, what am I saying, 10,000, 100 word version of this kind of idea that, and so I think that it's if that's sort of the model you kind of have in your head of it being something that you essentially replaces a job, or then of course you're immediately going to be sort of not suspicious, but you're going to be sort of like skeptical. And I think that once you start thinking about it in the way that Alex thinks about it, it becomes a bit more intuitive. But it isn't obvious, I think, right away. And I think that sort of was obvious during the discussion. So I hope that at the very least it kind of they were discussing the idea in the right way, as opposed to arguing against a paper tiger, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. It does take a while to get to grips with what Alex is saying. I think the way he explains his ideas is like it's not the same way that I explain those ideas to myself now that I've been sort of studying it for a while. So that's like part of the reason why I got involved at Gresham, was because I was hoping that I can sort of try and bridge the gap between Alex's world and everybody else's world, and try to sort of tell a story about tell the same story that Alex is thinking, but in my own words, and hope that can sort of be understood quicker by people. That would be nice.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm sort of I'm struggling with the same sort of thing when I discuss this idea with people. The same sort of things come up, and it's sort of like it's not necessarily maybe as intuitive, because I think the thing that most people think of when they think of UBI immediately is like robots and replacing jobs and stuff like that. And while those are all important, they're not the first. That's not the goal of what Alex is talking about. But they could indirectly. I think that's the key. Is that maybe that's missing is that a lot of these things, a lot of the way you would reframe the economy, or maybe how it would respond to the incentives, would indirectly sort of trickle down and and be positive, have a positive effect on these sort of trends that we see. But it's not a straight line. And whereas there's a straight line, jobs taking away, give people money, that sort of seems like a really slam dunk idea. But explaining like a sort of a series of causal things that ultimately change how a system works, that's not intuitive for most people. And I agree. It's like I don't even know what the right. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on how to kind of like make that more intuitive and quicker to sort of.
Well, you mentioned you mentioned automation and robots being like people's entry point into it, and that basically was my entry point to it as well. I'd say probably back around like 2014 sort of time when I started doing my master's in computer vision, and people were basically paying me to do research in how to automate stuff, right, and write software that could do things that you would normally pay a human being to do. And I twigged pretty quickly that the reason they're paying me to do this stuff is that right now, well, they're having to pay people to do various boring, unpleasant jobs involving data and images, and they'd much rather just get a machine to do it because it can do it more reliably and you won't have to pay it. And on the one hand, that's fundamentally a good thing in and of itself, right? Work sucks. That's why you have to pay people to do it. And if you can get a machine to do stuff for you, that should just be a good thing for everybody. But on the other hand, it was also obvious that this was going to result in job losses. That's why they're paying me to develop the technology. And I didn't want to sort of hurt people that way either. That sort of got me thinking, why are we in this weird position where we've got like this tension between labor-saving technology and the desire to use people's time and labor efficiently, and the need to get money to people through jobs at the same time, right? These things seem to be in conflict often. Like, why are so many people? Why are we treating jobs like a resource? Basically, I think is what it comes down to. Why are we always trying to make more jobs for people when jobs really are at cost, right? It means you're sacrificing your time and your energy to do something. Why should it ever? Why it doesn't make sense that we could be in any kind of a crisis because we've run out of work. That should just be a good thing. We should just have like more free time now. And that's kind of I guess for me, that's the problem that basic income solves, right? It gets rid of this dilemma because it means that you no longer have to provide jobs for people as like a financial lifeline. It means that jobs only have one purpose in a basic income world. You just hire people to do stuff, right? And you never, at the policy level, you don't ever try to create jobs so that people will have them. And it's the same with like, whether it's public sector or private sector, right? My objection to the federal jobs guarantee, it's not that I object to federal jobs, right? There's lots of things that governments need to employ people to do. You can't rely on the free hands of the market to fix roads for you. The incentives aren't right. But when you get into it's the guarantee part that I object to, because that specifically means that the government should create jobs over and above the jobs it would actually create because it needs stuff doing, right? It's like it necessarily implies that you're creating unnecessary work that doesn't actually need doing at all so that you can get money to people, right? Because if those jobs that are in the federal jobs guarantee were actually needed, well, then they'd already be hiring people for those reasons without the federal jobs guarantee part, right? So if the federal jobs guarantee is making any more jobs on top of what the government's already employing, then, well, it shouldn't. You should just give people the money instead, right? Like, they can't be that necessary, or else they'd already be hiring people. That sort of thing. It's a bit rambling, but does that make sense?
Yep, totally.
Hi,
Hi, Alex.
Hey, guys.
My name is Good. I am sorry. I am calling you. I am in Africa, and I am a PADI scuba instructor. I am French, and for the past 4 years, I've been working on reframing, the PADI business model. I've transposed it in lateral thinking to the digital realm. Basically, the PADI model is not really discussed anywhere in the world. But for me, as Daniel Schmachtenberger, I don't know if you know him. He was, he is specialized in systems thinking, and he said that we needed to develop, the open digital society. So as, PADI, the Professional Association of Diving Instructors, is the global leader, on the diving industry. They succeeded in 56 years to develop, over, 186 countries, respecting all, regulation of each country, to implement, their universal approach to scuba diving. And I was thinking, because we need to develop, the digital education, how to develop, how you call that in English, to develop productivity growth, by producing clean data that AI companies as OpenAI or all the big tech players, because they need that desperately in order for them to make their AI function well.
Hey, Michael, but
I develop.
It's
Yeah.
hard to hear you a little bit. I think I am following most of it, but just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. We just watched a podcast. Alex appeared on it on Professor Steve Keen's YouTube channel to talk about universal basic income. I just want to make sure we were on the same page. Had you seen that? And did you have any kind of questions about how that went, or our model UBI, or anything like that?
Yes, that's because I thought about that UBI, and I've designed something called a universal natural income, where people could actually by training with AI in human AI collaboration could earn actually while training a universal, not just basic income, but real income, because the big tech companies could be, we could sell, actually, that human AI collaboration training based on producing solutions within the framework of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And this money, this productivity growth could be paid by the big tech players if we sell, that human AI training data. Because the UBI, like in France, for instance, you've got a form of UBI, a UB national thing, and it's 500 euros per month or 580 euros per month. And this is done, this is given to people like that. And there's a huge problem with that because people just use it and make black market, job on the side, and they don't care
About that, I
of,
make sure I use Alex's time efficiently while he's here because he probably can't stick around forever. He just did like a 2 or 3 hour talk. So if you had any questions for Alex specifically about his model, this would be a great time to pose that. Otherwise, I'm super happy to talk with you about that later. I'd like to hear about how those policies are working over there because I'm not super familiar with it.
yeah, of course, sorry. Well, basically, I don't have much question about, because for a UBI to be accepted, it would need to be accepted in every country in the world. And the problem is that we need to have, for the United States, I don't know, it would necessarily, come from, some ratio or rate, I don't know how you call that, sorry for my English, but no, sorry, I don't have any good question.
Well, I think that's an important question. What are the global implications of universal basic income, and what happens when one country implements it or tries to implement it, and then the other countries don't? That kind of thing. How do you get to a point where you're at a global basic income paid to everyone in the world unconditionally? And I think for most of the people here in this discussion, that's kind of the end goal, right? Like that would be the ideal implementation of UBI would be something global for every person.
That would be, I've heard, Jeffrey Sachs, an economist, and really he said that some countries, don't want that. And plus, we need to know how we can finance it. And based on current global financing, based on debt only, subsidies, taxation, it needs a force, a tractor, and it needs to be, it's an obligation that we need to align, the real world economy to the financial economy, the economics. So we came to a point where there are just impossibilities based on the former way of thinking. And I'm just an autodidact, right? I've been learning by myself for the past 4 years. And based on the Schumpeter theory, where right now we are still in these former business practices based on game A, and we have as well, all the like Harvard business economics section, they've deployed. They are all, pushing for the zero marginal cost, which develop, which push and increase the market fragmentation. So it will lead to a business asphyxia. And
What will lead to a
we
business
can't
asphyxia?
continue like that.
Just the
The
status
zero
quo?
marginal cost.
Oh, zero margin. Well, there's no
zero,
such thing as that. I've heard people talk about the zero marginal cost. I think there's always going to be scarce resources that are, that we're going to have to allocate, right? And they're going to be priced. And there are some things that have zero, or it can be modeled as close to zero marginal cost, like copying data on the internet or something like that. And that's fine. But there's always going to be a need to allocate resources, scarce resources, and to figure out how to produce the actual things that we need to be produced out of those resources. So I'm not too worried about that. In general, though, I mean, it's okay if businesses fail, right? If they're not providing something useful, then it's okay for them to fail, right? We don't need to keep businesses going arbitrarily.
Yes, but I've been working, remotely as a translator for a blog in geopolitics, finance, and economics.
Okay.
So I've, inside when I was working, they were, crushing all the charges, right? And there's a big impact on the people who work at the core level, at the basic level. And even me, I had, that's the jungle down there. And I can tell because I've experienced it. And this is not livable, for the people. So for me, economics, it's like a cake recipe. It's like, what are your resources that you can exploit that are sustainable? You need a machine or processes in order to transform. For me, basically, problems, mega threats problems, could be transformed through human AI processes into solutions. And for me, a solution is a form of energy because it provides mobility. So
I guess my question for you, Maud, is what is the problem that you are imagining addressing here?
Well, if we want to have a universal income and not just basic, we need to produce added values.
Yeah, and I guess you're imagining that the you're coming with ideas for how to increase what the economy produces so the universal basic income can be higher. Is that correct?
Yes, and it needs
Okay.
to be something that people have in common. And I believe that we could harness, the 17 sustainable development goals from the
Yeah.
UN
So
and
I think for
put
us,
it as an objective.
I think for us, what we're focusing on is not really the amount of the UBI, but more the idea that it makes sense to use UBI as our money distribution mechanism instead of current money distribution mechanisms that maybe aren't as effective, aren't as efficient, that kind of thing. But I think you're right that once you've done that, there's still a lot of room for, like, well, how can we increase it, right? And I think you're talking about some interesting ideas for how to move in that direction and how to become more productive. I also think it's true that once you've decided to use UBI as your money distribution mechanism and you've committed to calibrating it to the level the economy could sustain, then anyone who's developing a new technology or any kind of labor saving anything or figuring out a way to be more productive, they're going to know that society and the economy are going to make use of that advancement, right? Because they're going to know that people are going to have the money to spend to buy the whatever the product is, right? So I think I think it's an interesting discussion of like what kinds of specific things we can do to make the economy more productive, but it's not the thing we mainly focus on here.
Yeah, because I see, for me, that everything is interconnected today. And the UBI, if we call it universal basic income, it needs to be accepted by all the countries, and there are 195 countries.
I don't know about that.
And
I think, like a country like the United States, if they wanted to, they could decide to pay a UBI to everyone in the world, right? And they don't have to get the consent of foreign governments. I guess foreign governments could come in and kind of block the payments or something like that, but then maybe those
surely
people just
they would
move
have
to
to
the
get.
United States.
They'd
Well,
need the consent of foreign governments. Surely you couldn't.
you don't need the consent of foreign governments to have the policy of giving everyone money. You do need the consent of foreign governments to let the money through, but those people could just move to the country that's paying out the basic income too, as long as that country has open borders, right? And then I guess you'd need the consent of the foreign country to let those people leave or something like that. But really, instituting the policy itself doesn't require anyone else's consent.
but how do you where do you get that money, to pay, that UBI?
Right. So the way
If
to
it
think
was coming from the United States.
Yeah. So the way that we think about UBI is that it's an alternative way of pushing money into the economy. So instead of having the Fed having low interest rates and stimulating the financial sector, the government just pays out the money directly. So it would replace a lot of people's wages and things like that.
How it could be, sustainable, that we would be assured that the UBI could be financed by, the government. So it would be either by the debt market.
We're saying
it
that
would be either by taxation.
The question of how to make the financing sustainable is important. I really like Alex's model for this because he sort of points out that calibrating the amount is actually kind of the most important thing you need to do. If we were to finance UBI by deficit spending it, in theory, there's a certain amount of that we can do right now that doesn't break anything, that allows markets to be more productive and allows monetary policy to get a little tighter without anything really going wrong. Then after you've done that, then the question is, if you're not satisfied with that amount, are there other things we could do? Maybe we should change other policies like tax policy. So there's a lot of other things you could do, but we really emphasize that even with like traditional deficit spending, the way it already works today for financing other government programs, there's some amount that you can do that with UBI right now, and that will actually work. So you can think of that as like a low-hanging fruit. that we could grasp right now. And then once you've discovered this optimal amount, this for now, then we can talk about changing tax policies or doing other policies that might allow us to do a little bit better and get the rate up even higher.
So I used to
And
think.
I have another question.
No, go on.
Sure.
Okay, I mean, I used to think
Well-
that you know, the money has to come from somewhere. Okay, governments can't just print money because that causes inflation. So, you know, basic income is going to be expensive because the government has to tax in order to fund it, right? Otherwise, you know, they can't just keep borrowing or printing money or whatever to fund some massive spending program like a basic income, because it would inevitably cause inflation. And this was just a thing that I just sort of assumed automatically, and it seems very sort of obvious and intuitive, like I think it does to most people. And yeah, Alex got me to sort of question that a little bit more and to think a little bit more carefully about why would it cause inflation exactly, and how would it cause inflation. I wonder, I mean, what would your answer be to that? I presume, I mean, I'm assuming a lot here, but I assume that you're assuming, as most people do, that if we were to just print money and give it to people, then the result would automatically, definitely, necessarily be inflation. How exactly would that inflation occur? What's the mechanism? Why does it have to be like that way exactly? I'm interested to hear just what you would say about that.
Are you talking about me?
Yeah.
Who is that to,
Yeah.
Phil?
To Maud, or well, to anybody really, I guess, but to Maud really.
You had a lot. That's a lot to unpack. Sorry, please, ask me a smaller question, please. I'm sorry, I am Asperger, autistic,
Okay.
so.
No, that's fine. And also, I definitely encourage you, Maud, if you'd like, you could check out. We have some links here, some of the papers we've written that kind of summarize some of these concepts we talk about. I'd really encourage you to check a couple of them out, and you're welcome to post some questions in the chat here, and also anything else that you're working on or studying. There's a lot of people here who like to chat about economics. I did want to ask Alex some of your thoughts about the show you just went on, because that was really exciting. And I wanted to hear how that went from your point of view. I just want to say I thought it went really well, and I thought they asked really good questions, and they were interested clearly in learning more about your model of UBI, which I thought was great. There were a couple standout parts for me, but I guess I wanted to start with just like a broad reaction from you about how that went.
Yeah, I thought it was good. I think it took us a while to get to like the core stuff. So I'm thinking in my head about like, how could we have started by like really defining UBI? Like Steve Keen was calling guaranteed income UBI like halfway through the discussion. And I finally, after, it took me a few minutes to get in here because I was still talking to everybody over there for a little while. And I got Steve Keen to agree to start saying guaranteed income instead of UBI. So I don't know if that's a win or not, because now he's not pro UBI anymore. He's anti UBI and pro guaranteed income.
Yeah. But I thought he was asking good questions about your model and how it was the effect on interest rates. So I know that what you guys have in common is you're both kind of would probably both agree that the private financial sector, on its own is not a kind of an automatic magical source of all the economy's spending power. And you probably both agree there's something clearly wrong with that, or it's overextended. They might describe that a little differently than the way you talk about it. But he clearly was interested. So I'd really love to hear him kind of engage with that more. The host was quite interested in your model too, and asked a lot of good questions and made a lot of good points about it. So
yeah, Dave. Yeah,
I certainly got the impression that about 2/3 of the way through, maybe 3/4 of the way through, Steve seemed to sort of kind of get what Alex was coming at, but it took a while to get there because he seemed to noticeably soften, I think, towards this. Oh, I see. You're not arguing for guaranteed income. You're arguing for something different. And I thought that was sort of it would have been nicer for that to have come earlier, so you could have had a more beefy discussion about, rather than arguing about a paper tiger.
Alex,
like a few basic points weren't sort of like sinking in until like the second half of the video or something, I think,
And one thing you can do, I think, Alex, you've done this before in other videos, is if you kind of flag up front that like, here's the definition of UBI, I think about it a little differently than other people, is that if you can make that clear to people, then that might help, because it's true that when you say UBI, people are going to attach everything that they're coming at it with, and that can drag it down. So when it started, I was a little worried about about the show, but partway through, I think
Yeah.
you kind of cleared it up, and you took some good opportunities to steer the conversation back towards, well, a universal unconditional income, right? The subject, the title of the video. So I thought that went well.
I think part of what happened was I had linked to them my mistake of full employment talk beforehand, so they all just came from watching that. So the first question was already about like, is there work that we don't need or something like that. It wasn't about UBI directly, but yes, about some ways in, I kind of pressed pause on the conversation and said like, okay, this is what UBI is, and and then I asked everyone kind of what problem it solved, and then kind of like brought it back together. And I think that's kind of where it really got started there.
I thought so too. Yeah. What did you? I noticed that you the part where I noticed the most apparent disagreement with you and Steve Keen was really about the borrowing versus money creation thing, which I worry that maybe you came off sounding that like you were saying that government borrowing sort of isn't creating money or something like that. But
I didn't mean to say that.
Well, I don't think you said that, but it seemed, based on his reaction, it seemed like he might have interpreted you that way, because certainly you both agree that ultimately at the end of the day these are just two different ways of creating money.
Right,
I guess
Steve Keen actually
is it important in Keen's view that like the private sector doesn't create money and the public sector does, or does he?
No, the other way around. I think he said it specifically. It was the other way around. I remember that really surprised me when he said that. He was saying the private sector does create money, and like government spending doesn't. It's just negative equity, whatever that means.
No, he was saying that the government does create money, but that they don't create money when they issue debt. They create money when they spend. That's the point that he was trying to make.
And they
for
spend
me,
by going into negative equity.
yeah, and that's when the money is actually created. I think that's a semantic distinction. I think you could.
It all sounds really semantic. Yeah, I mean, what exactly are we arguing about, right?
But he was saying that he modeled it, and that my way of saying it is somehow wrong because of his model. So that sounds like not a semantic thing. At least he's not thinking about it that way.
Like, so what you're going to ask with these, if you're going to have a different theory, and you think it's like not just a different framing or a different formulation, but it's really a different belief, then like you always got to ask the question, like, what kind of different prediction does it make, right?
Yeah. And my sense was that he's kind of thinking about it the same way as me, but using different language. Like, is the money creation? What's that?
And Jeff Crocker as well, right? There's like the three of you. You got Jeff Crocker saying it's debt-free sovereign money. You got Alex Halmer saying no, it's just debt, and then you've got Steve Keen saying it's negative equity. And these are apparently like three different accounting conventions for depending on what you think of as money and what you don't. Right.
Well, it's negative equity whenever the government spends, right? That pushes the equity further negative, right? So I think we'd all agree on that. The question is, where does the money? And I think Jeff is saying that governments don't borrow at all, or no? What's he saying? He's saying that governments do borrow, but they don't have to. They can issue money instead. I'm saying, well, it's the same thing. And then Steve Keen, I think, is maybe saying that governments don't borrow, or that the issuing of treasury securities is not where the money creation happens. So he's saying money is created when you spend rather than when you issue the liability. You can frame it either way. If I go to my bank and I take out a loan, is money created at the moment I borrowed from the bank? Most people would say that. But you could also, argue that it's when I spend the money into the economy, that's when the money is created.
Right, because if you never spent it, then it wouldn't make any difference, right? You'd just be sort of sitting on stuff forever, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to think of it that way, sure. Sure.
Yeah, so that's why I tried to say, like, okay, you're releasing money that wasn't there, and I tried to get around, like, the borrowing, and I wasn't entirely successful in that.
It's tricky. I mean, Alex, because I understand from, if you're taking kind of the Maryland school of thought, that point of view about how money and debt are really intimately related. Often money is a form of debt. I can understand why you'd want to frame government, money creation as like, and as borrowing as a form of money creation, because it is creating money. I guess the other thing, but what's important to point out there, though, is that, like, mechanically speaking, right, like the operation of creating treasury, like issuing treasury securities, is different from just spending money. And so when someone says to me, you might be hearing this differently, but when someone says to me, makes a claim that, like, oh, the government does create money and it does borrow, but it doesn't have to borrow in order to create money. Like, for me, I would interpret that pretty straightforwardly as saying like, well, the government can issue treasury securities while it's creating money, but it doesn't have to. And I sort of would agree with that. But are you interpreting that in a different way? Do you feel like that's a confusing way of putting it?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on how detailed you want to get, right? Because there's big picture, you can say when the government spends in excess of taxes, they're creating money. They're printing money. Mechanically speaking, the government is issuing treasury securities, and the Fed is buying some of them, and the stuff that's actually money that can be spent is being issued by the Fed, and that's happening not when the government borrows per se, but it's happening when they buy up the treasury security that's already out there on the market. Okay. All right, you can do that. You can say that the money creation happens not when the government spends, but when the Fed buys treasuries. Okay, that's fine. Or you can say that the money is created when the government borrows, and you can assume that the Fed is going to be the ultimate creditor or something like that. Or you could say that the well, actually, no. I mean, like, it depends on what counts as money too, right? Because if a regular bank is buying treasury securities and issuing deposits for it, then the money is being created right there as well. I think if you do it all on balance sheets, like if Steve Keen and I sat down and did it on balance sheets, we'd have the same balance sheets and we'd be telling the same story. We'd just be using slightly different language. I think there's
which is why balance sheets are cool.
Balance sheets are cool, yeah.
And that's why they're cool.
Yeah, that's why any common language is cool, because you can communicate. And I think there's an aversion to saying that the government borrows, especially among MMTers and MMT adjacent people, because they're worried that people will think that the government has to get the money from somewhere and there might not be enough money out there. But really, even when you're borrowing from a bank, new money is being created, right? That's true if I go to the bank for a loan, new money is being created, right? It's a swap of IOUs, and the bank's IOUs are money, right? So I think they're trying to get away from this aversion to the government being constrained by, well, how much they can borrow, right? So that's why they're saying that the government doesn't borrow.
And they tend to consolidate the government and central bank's balance sheets and see the central bank as like a part of the government. So then it's like the government's borrowing from itself, and well, what does that even mean, right? It doesn't make sense to think of borrowing from yourself, so you might as well call it money printing or something.
Oh, borrowing it from yourself. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And I mean, like, if you see the swap of IOUs thing, it goes in a circle, right? One IOU goes one way, one IOU goes the other way. So you fund your own loan anyway, right? Your deposits are funding your own loan when you borrow from a bank. So you are borrowing. The bank is borrowing from you, and you're borrowing from the bank at the same time. So you're borrowing from yourself. Also, the bank is borrowing from itself. But okay, one of those instruments is money, and the other one is not.
Yeah, I mean, surely what it all comes down to is liquidity, right? It's the ability for people to actually buy stuff right now, right? Like, why is it that taking a loan out creates money, but just buying a car or something doesn't create money? Well, when you take a loan out, then you gain liquidity, you gain the ability to spend money right now that you didn't have before, and nobody else has lost it, right?
Well, if a bank bought a car by issuing its own liabilities, that would be creating money. And whoever's buying the car is releasing money into the broader economy that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been released.
And you may think of that as creating money as well, because if they were just sort of hoarding it or something otherwise, then it might as well not exist. But then when they spend it, then it's like it goes into circulation and it matters suddenly.
Yeah, I like the terms releasing and absorbing money, because I think they're pretty neutral. Like, you're not going to be like, oh no, they're creating money and destroying money.
Yeah, but it didn't work that well though. When you said that, it's like
yeah, it didn't work, did it?
It's unusual. It's unusual, and like I thought you kept your cool like really well in that, by the way. So well done there. And he did come around a bit like later on, I think.
Okay. I wasn't sure how I was coming across. I thought maybe I was talking over people a little too much during some of it.
He totally was as well. I don't know.
I thought it was great. I mean, I really liked what you chose to focus on, and I liked that you were drawing attention to broken money distribution systems, overemployment, and financial sector instability as kind of logical results of having an improper money distribution system. And I think that was made clear to people there. I think they understood ultimately at the end kind of the differences between your perspective and where they were coming at it from. So I thought that was good. And I like that you spoke up and tried to make it really clear where those differences were, because that's where all the helpful discussion can happen. And I think sometimes if someone's feathers get a little ruffled, that's kind of like inevitable if we're going to suddenly be made aware of like, oh, a difference or disagreement that we didn't think existed, right? It's like it's like you're driving on the road and a pothole appears, so there's a problem. But then if you're aware of it, then you can maybe fix the pothole or do something. So I don't know. I thought it went really well.
Yeah, there was one question I didn't think got answered at all that I'd be interested to hear Alex's thoughts on was that, or at least there wasn't sort of enough discussion of it, was this elimination of the business cycle, or claiming that it would never be possible to eliminate the business cycle, and sort of like, was that an absolute thing versus just reducing it? Like, what is sort of the, like, what is your feeling on that? Was that and his argument for that, Alex?
Yeah, so they brought in a couple different perspectives on the business cycle, like, oh, it's about real investment and technological advancements, and you finish that investment and then there's a lull because you've completed constructing that capital or whatever. So they brought in that. They also brought in this idea of like it's a class struggle between workers and capitalists. So I was going to try to respond to that with a little bit of an olive branch, saying that, okay, let's bracket that and say all of that is true. There is some aspect of the business cycle that has to do with an excessive buildup of private sector debt becoming unstable over time. And that is what UBI is an alternative to, right? It's an alternative to using that debt bubble to push money to consumers. You can give it to them directly. So I was going to try to emphasize that kind of it eliminates this aspect of the business cycle, which I think is most of it. And I think I don't have to try to like argue that, but I can certainly argue that if we're handing people money directly, we don't need to be pushing money to people through the financial sector and jobs, right? But I think, so I think it's, I don't think we would have had another we wouldn't have had 2008 if we'd had a calibrated basic income. I don't think, because that was a financial crisis that led to the recession. And yeah.
What is your intuition about the degree to which, like, if you get it properly calibrated, because that's a general question. Once you did, let's say after a couple of cycles of trying and adjusting and whatever, like, how much do you think you could actually like reduce it? I mean, is there sort of some upper limit to the degree to, in other words, is it smoothing out, like I think Ty said, or is it smoothing out to the point where it's almost essentially not there at all, or is there something in between?
I think it's more towards smoothing out to the point where there's almost nothing at all, because it's really, if you think about why there are banking crises, financial crises, and credit crises, is that the financial institutions have become too interdependent, right? So the dominoes are too close together. So one domino knocks over the next one. Whereas if you could have a financial sector and you can have a financial institution fail without bringing down the whole system, as long as it's not too built up and interconnected.
I love your analogy of the dominoes, like moving them further apart, because I think that's really evocative, and immediately people can grasp that. They're like, oh, of course, it's like, and it's not, you're not removing the dominoes altogether. You're just,
right.
You're kind of, so UBI is kind of, in a way, kind of moving the knob that is kind of basically making that domino board like a little less fragile. Is that a good analogy in your head?
Yeah, I think that's right. So maybe there will be, there are always going to be situations where people are worse off or people are better off. To what extent will it be kind of a systemic slump or systemic crisis or something like that? Well, I don't think it's going to be that much, right? And even if you have real investments where like, oh, the investment is done and people aren't employed as much because of that, it's like, well, you started before the investment and then the investment happened and now the economy is more productive. So maybe the UBI is higher after the investment is done. There doesn't have to be a slump there. People stop working in those jobs because they're not needed anymore, and that's fine. But that also, means the basic income can be higher.
I think it's an interesting component of your theory, the idea that a properly calibrated UBI might end the business cycle entirely. I think it's also true that in the same way people might be skeptical that a UBI, if you calibrated it today, that you'd end poverty doing that. For example, Steve Keen was skeptical of that. Some people might be skeptical that you're going to end this kind of financial sector instability altogether. I think it's probably harder to argue against the idea, right, that if you're pushing up UBI as a source of consumer spending and that allows for tighter monetary policy, it's sort of harder to argue that wouldn't improve financial sector stability, right? So I don't know. I'm curious what you think of that model.
I think depending on the crowd, it's harder to argue. I think with the MMT crowd, they think that higher interest rates are bad, and lower interest rates are.
Is that because
good.
it makes it just they imagine consumers borrowing and now they're having to pay higher interest rates and that hurts them more? Because I do get that fairly often.
They imagine consumers borrowing. They imagine workers losing their jobs. Mm-hmm. Both of those.
Right. Okay.
I wonder if one of the major things, I mean, the thing that you immediately think about higher interest rates, and for most people, like your average person, they're going to be thinking mortgages. And how would that, is it something that if you introduced it, it would, maybe mortgages would go up, but because of some other ways the economy is being reconfigured, that it would make mortgages more affordable in the long run so that you would net out positive? I mean, how that, I guess, that, to me, if there was a crisp answer to that kind of question, like that you could sort of put in a short version, then that would, I think, help people make it more concrete. Because I think because higher interest rates are immediately people are going to think about that. So I don't know. Do you have some kind of quick, sketch of how that might operate in practice?
Yeah, because Steve was skeptical that you were gonna cut off money through higher interest rates on the one hand, but then sort of compensate for that with a higher basic income on the other hand, or somebody was making that criticism, and
Yeah, well, let me respond to Alex. That there would be fewer mortgages. Mortgages wouldn't be a thing as much, right? Interest rates would be higher, which would make borrowing more expensive, which would be one of the factors that would kind of help drive down housing prices, and then people would have money to spend, right? So
basically make mortgages less of a thing in a way.
Exactly.
Which in a way, actually, that it just as, I mean, I know you're on policy or the political side of it, but that itself would, I mean, the fact that we accept mortgages as the default way that we basically get access to housing is, in my opinion, kind of a problem anyway. It's been a problem for a long time, and it wasn't always this way. I don't think it wasn't. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't really until the 20s that became a
I think that's right. Yeah, and it's not even the same in every country either. Like the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that's kind of a US thing, I think. But other countries
totally,
have mortgages, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Australia, they're variable. I mean, that's one of the things that scared people when interest rates go up there, that I didn't really fully appreciate because I've never owned a place back in my own country. But they as soon as the interest rates jump up, it just affects everyone immediately. And I think, and actually, this may be an indirect reason why maybe Steve thought of that, being Australian himself, may have immediately jumped to that concept, because unlike here, you can ride out a high interest, but you can't in other countries, like you said.
Yeah.
Anyway. But wouldn't that take a long? That would take a long. I mean, I think that guess a counter argument.
It would take an adjustment period, right?
Yeah, it would
it's not like
long,
UBI. Now it's fixed. Yeah.
Right. How would that affect the way that if mortgages are less? How much would your wages and savings have to be in order for you to buy houses outright? Have to be before you could, housing would be more affordable again or something. I don't know.
Yeah. One thing I like to emphasize sometimes is there's the economics of the transition into the UBI world, and then there's the economics of the UBI world after all the shocks have been kind of, worked through the system and everything like that. And certainly, what happened, all these people already have these contracts, right? These mortgage contracts. So what happens when you start introducing a UBI to all the mortgages that are already out there? And that could be, that could be a tricky thing that has to be figured out.
Rocky.
Yeah. Rocky. Yeah.
I've got a question. How much, you think, a UBI should be?
Yeah, so that's the question, right? We don't know, right? The question is what level of consumer spending can the economy handle? So that's why I advocate a policy of calibrating the UBI. So you decide that you want to have a UBI and you start with the amount very small and you increase the amount and see how it affects the economy until you get to a point where increasing it any further isn't going to give you any more benefit. And I would imagine that that's what I call, the amount you settle on, that's what I call the natural rate of UBI for the economy. And I imagine that that rate would increase over time. And it's different depending on what country you're talking about. Are you talking about a global UBI, right? All of these things kind of factor in.
I wonder if you think that,
For
because I think
instance,
this is
in France,
oh,
it's
sorry,
about
Maud,
600.
go ahead.
What's that?
In France, for instance, it's 600 around.
Right, but it's not a UBI, right? It only goes to people who don't have other sources of money, right?
Right. No, but just, to compare for, the consumption, level.
Yeah.
And that's the very minimum basics, that you can even hardly, survive with that.
Yeah.
So-
So if you had, for instance, $1,500, dollars, in the United States, because, the life standing, it's higher, it's more costly. If it becomes a universal, standing, for instance, where I am living right now in Madagascar, $1,500 it would be like, cruises. It would be like, what they would never had, dreamed of. They could never had.
Yeah.
So, see, if you have a universal basic income, first of all, it could be, the same, amount, for every country. And,
Yeah.
or if it's just the United States, sending it, to any countries, what are, the highest, risk, in terms of sending in a poor country, like the third, poorest country in Madagascar, it would be crazy. They would be, because as they are not educated, like in the United States, they would drink, they would be getting on drugs, it would be crazy.
Yeah. I think
There's
that's
lots of risk.
I mean, we have tried basic income experiment. Like Give Direct, we have done the world's biggest basic income experiments, and those were in Africa, in very poor rural villages in Kenya and Uganda, where people were not educated. They've given pretty good evidence that like the whole drugs and drinking problem thing, it didn't really happen there.
And also, it's not these issues
Yeah, but
are
I'm living-
interesting.
I'm
They're
living in
interesting, but they're not
Madagascar.
important for the problem that we're trying to solve here, right? Like, if people spend their money irresponsibly, then we might want to address that in some way. But that's not a reason to choose to distribute money inefficiently, right? And in terms of the amount of the money, the idea is that it's the same everywhere. So it's going to go a lot further in some places than other places, and it's going to be spent differently by different people with different cultures. I don't think the answer to people's drug and alcohol problems is to withhold money from people preventively, like by default. I think the answer is to say, oh, hey, there are some people who are having some problems. Let's figure something out.
I wonder, Alex, if you
Yeah.
think, just to go back to your point about, or the point about the sort of numbers and the calibration, and
Yeah.
like obviously they were pressing you on that, but I'm wondering, and I understand why you don't want to give a specific number generally, but do you think, is there any kind of idea of maybe there might be almost like a de minimis, like in legal terms, of amount that you could try? Like, I mean, even at the level of sort of like, if the way that the federal government wrote stimulus checks to everyone who had or basically credited their joint accounts or whatever accounts directly you know, like, could you imagine like doing like, you know, like $1 a month in everyone? Like, would that
Yeah.
be enough of an experiment just to get the thing started?
Well, I don't
Like
know if
so
I'd call it an
small that
experiment, but I think it's an important step. Like if you can pay
yeah,
everyone $1 a month, then you've got the machinery in place to do the whole thing, right?
right.
So once you've got $1 a month, you can increase from there, and it's
But I'm
worth
saying
doing.
that do you think that would that be enough to like note an effect? Do you think
Um,
potentially?
Probably not enough to notice an effect on the economy, really, but
Yeah.
it might be enough to. I mean, it gets your foot in the door with the machinery. I think is all it does, really.
Right. Right.
I like the idea though. Maybe if you get to like $100 a month or something, you know, there is, I think, some balancing point where it's, you know, it's high enough to tell you something about whether it's helping or not, but it's low enough that it's not too risky, and that's where we need to start.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
I don't think it's dangerous to start at $1 a month, but I also don't think it's dangerous to start at $100 a month. Like my intuition tells me that, and I'm not worried about Steve Keen's concern of like, oh, if you do UBI, then that will cause some people to starve because it won't be a high enough amount. It's like, well, people are starving now, and any amount of UBI will, kind of make a difference.
Right. I guess that kind of comes from the idea that immediately that people are assuming that UBI is immediately going to be used for people who don't have any money at all. But like you said, if they don't have any money at all, then I mean, the lion's share of people are going to have some, probably likely to have some job if the unemployment rate's low. So it's sort of a bit of a, I think immediately people will, there's a sort of assumption that you're immediately going to have to supply people's basic needs from a basic income from the get-go, which isn't likely to be true, right?
Yeah. And I think there's this kind of assumption in people's mind, yeah, that basic income is enough to live on, right? That's kind of part of the definition of what it is. So what are you even doing if it's below that amount? And I think it gets scary when I talk about like, oh, it's eliminating wages and eliminating jobs. So then he's like, well, you're eliminating people's wages and jobs, and you're replacing with something that's a lot less. Is kind of what it I think felt like to him. Whereas it's like the amount of the UBI is going to probably be higher than the wages that have been lost, at least in aggregate, and how that kind of
Keen didn't agree with
distributes
that,
out.
though.
Yeah, and how that kind of just distributes out among individual people. Some people might be worse off; they lost their job and got the UBI, but I don't know, maybe they could get another job or something. People are going to be better off on average.
Well, this is great. I've got to go, folks. This has been great to catch up with you and Alex and Derek and
Yeah,
everyone
and
else and Phil.
we really do need to get together with Nick and hang out sometime.
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe talk modeling.
Yeah. Do you do any system dynamics modeling? Are you thinking like agent-based modeling or?
I'm mostly agent, but I have kind of had a little bit of experience with systems and differential equation type stuff. So, yeah, be interested to talk about that at some point.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right. Thanks,
Okay.
Alex.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Catching up with you.
Yep.
So was that a guy from Boston Basic Income then?
Yeah, and he lives around here.
Alex,
He was from when we were doing it in person. He and Nick Putnam came together. Yeah.
Yeah, he seems cool.
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like there's so much more I wanted to talk to than I got to talk about. Yeah.
I'm glad you got a chance to chat a little bit more afterwards with them, informally. But it's interesting. I think if they're curious, I'm sure you'll hear more from them. There's always discussion that's not recorded or put out on the internet, right? And that may actually be a better forum for like deep questioning, right? But I'm glad that you got an opportunity to go out there on their show and raise some new interest and awareness. So I thought it went really well.
I wanted to respond to Ty's assertion that UBI typically comes with a tax. I didn't really get a chance to kind of comment on that, and he did some modeling or something, but it was all based on that assumption that there would be kind of taxes that match it. I wanted to talk about how you can think about a UBI on its own and its effects on its own, just like you can think about the effects of a tax on its own. It is a tax. It's a negative tax, negative head tax.
Yeah, that's interesting. People really do want to associate it with these other policies, but we're used to frameworks where we try to. I think maybe something you could emphasize there is like, obviously we'd like to have a calibrated basic income that doesn't have any tax policies associated with it, but you could emphasize that to understand the theories of basic income, we're modeling it as its own policy and trying to understand what effects it has. Like if you can you can implement your calibrated UBI and a land value tax at the same time if you want, but it's kind of useful just to understand the model, right? Like how does it work? That's sort of that's another way of putting it.
Because there were a lot of comments in the chat during that. Did you guys follow any of those?
No, it's way too fast.
It was too fast. I did actually write. I did follow some of them, and I wrote a little bit on my YouTube account in there, just a couple points, but not a lot. Just every once in a while.
Yeah, there were a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives in there.
A lot of people that weren't really, really super sold on UBI, but it was interesting that Steve Keen kind of was. I think, although it turned out maybe it was more of a guaranteed.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't really UBI.
Yeah.
And he's not thinking about it as, this kind of, he's not thinking about the interaction with private sector debt, which is something he thinks about a lot. He's thinking about it as the separate thing that solves a social problem.
I think if you can emphasize just that you really see you see UBI, I don't look at it as a solution to poverty per se. I don't look at it as a solution to AI or robots. I look at it as a alternative to expansionary monetary policy. Like if you put that up front, I think that if people ask me what it is, sometimes I just say it's a fiscal complement to monetary policy.
Or you just say as an alternative.
How we look at it. Go ahead, Phil.
Or as an alternative to full employment, and the expansionary monetary policy that we do to fuel full employment.
Yeah.
Depending on how you define full employment, yeah.
Yeah, max employment maybe, yeah. Or yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to, you could say we achieve. If you define it as the efficient level, great, UBI achieves full employment.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Cool. And did you hear, that the information economy, was talking about a UBI at their level?
The who? Who was talking about it?
The information economy. That was OpenAI. That was Sam Altman who was speaking about, this.
I don't think. I know Sam Altman has talked about UBI. He's also not thinking about it the way we think about it. I don't think.
There's not.
No, it's not the same thing, but it's in the same intention because they know that there's going to be a job disruption because of AI.
Yeah, they're wrong.
We're not really. Yeah, we take a different view. We sort of think that if we might already live in a world where there might be too much employment. In other words, inefficient use of labor. We could be getting more use out of our machines, including AI, but also lots of other machines in the economy. So we see UBI as an alternative to propping up the level of employment with the policies that we use today.
Yeah, we take the position that technology like automation lowers the amount of labor and employment that you need to make a certain amount of stuff. It doesn't necessarily create like an employment crisis though, because we can create jobs that aren't actually needed. Right? We can make more jobs for the purpose of the wages that they provide to people. And furthermore, that's not just a thing that we do once we have AI. It's a thing we're already doing. We've been doing it for a long time. We've had all kinds of technological breakthroughs that have drastically lowered the amount of employment that we really need, and we've compensated for it by making more unnecessary jobs. Because they are necessary, but they're not necessary because of what they make, they're necessary because of the wages they provide to people. And you wouldn't need them for the wages anymore if you had a basic income.
Yeah.
And what about, the psychological, effect on the people, because some people may not want, to work and just, take the basic income, as a way of living, and just to use it and be, do nothing.
Yeah.
What's
I
the
mean, I think
purpose of life?
I think that's
Basically.
on its own, that's fine, right? If people don't want to do anything, that's fine. If they're unhappy, then obviously, I don't know, we might want to do something
Yeah, so
to.
I gave a talk about basic income at my job at work. I think like was it last year or something or a while ago. A woman came up to me afterwards and she said that if she had a basic income and she didn't have to work anymore, then like she wouldn't go to work, she'd quit her job and she'd be really depressed and it would be terrible. And I was like, okay, well, if it's going to be that terrible and you'll be that depressed, then don't quit your job, you know? Like,
Well, it's not
yeah,
quite that simple because
No, because
once the UBI is implemented, a lot of the jobs might go away anyway. So her job,
I don't think hers would have, but yeah,
okay,
sure.
yeah.
You know, in a way, one way to think about this is that people do obviously they want. There's lots of different sources of people's meaning in their lives, and people do today. We do tend to associate like people's meaning or purpose with their paid job. That's a really big part of. That's kind of what people demand from economists and economic policymakers today. So you can think of the world we live in today as the sort of one possible solution to this. Like if people want jobs, then you can design policies to create jobs, and then you can do that. You can provide jobs to everyone by stimulating the financial sector and using other policies. We're sort of pointing out that there are trade-offs when you do that. There's problems created when you create more jobs than the market economy strictly needs. And so we think of UBI as a way to solve economic problems without creating jobs. If you're interested in the problem of like how to give people meaning and purpose, maybe there are actually government policies or economic policies that could be useful for that goal. But what we don't want, what we're trying to say is that you shouldn't be wrecking economic efficiency and making the private sector economy waste resources and waste people's time for that purpose. You know, you want to make sure the economy is working in a reasonably efficient way, and then we can ask other questions about what
Or
policies do we need.
more importantly, if you want to give people meaning and purpose and you're using policy to do that, be conscious about it and be explicit about it. If you are pretending that people are contributing when they're not, you're probably not doing the thing that's going to give them the most meaning and purpose.
Personally, I'm skeptical about the idea that you can actually give meaning or purpose to anybody. I think people have to discover these things for themselves. I don't think the economy really does give
Well,
people a great deal of meaning most of the time. Some jobs are meaningful. I think most of them really aren't. What they do is they keep people busy. And if you're busy all the time, you know, you're too exhausted to, you know, really think about such things, then, well, you don't confront the lack of meaning. You don't have time for it, right? You're just busy surviving all the time. And then you don't have the time or energy to really think about what it is that actually makes your life meaningful. Whereas, you know, if you didn't have to do your job anymore or it was eliminated, then you may have to confront such things. I don't think it's the economy's purpose to solve that problem for people, though. The economy is there to make nice things for us, pretty
well,
much.
the government can put resources into providing opportunities for people to find meaning and purpose, right? They could provide spaces for people to go or activities for people to do that they could sign up for, and you know, that kind of thing, and just
Yeah.
like kind of
I'm
create
maybe more of a
an
small
engaging
government
environment.
person than you are. I'm a little bit skeptical about the government's aptitude at doing things like that. I put more stock in what people can create for themselves when it comes to providing purpose. But sure, I mean, you could try some government programs that would fund such things, maybe
Well,
some grants or
I
something.
I think the important thing is that this is a separate question from the question of whether people get meaning and purpose kind of from jobs, and you're worried about eliminating jobs and eliminating meaning and purpose. I think Phil, you'd probably agree that the government can probably do a better job of helping people have meaning and purpose than making up fake jobs for the purpose of pushing the money under the pretense that they are contributing to the economy. I think the government can do better than that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of really unpleasant, boring, unnecessary bullshit jobs out there which take meaning out of people's lives, right? That's a very, very, very common thing. I've experienced it a little bit myself. If you read Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, I mean, the reason he wrote that book was this outpouring of empathy and emotion that he got from people when he wrote this one little article in a magazine about the idea that some people think their jobs are completely meaningless and horrible, and it tortures them that what they're spending all their time working on just seems to be so pointless. And it turns out a lot of people felt that way, and they all started writing emails into it, and so they wrote a book about it, right? There seems to be a lot of this sort of thing around. So yeah, I agree. I think it's important to try and separate
Well,
living from surviving as well. You know, like finding meaning and purpose in your life. That's about like, you know, having a life that's actually worth surviving for, right? And then, you know, actual survival. Well, the economy can provide you with that, right? The economy can provide you with the you know, all the things that you need to survive. It can't necessarily make life worth living. I don't know.
I was just, at first, saying about the UBI, like you would have money and don't do anything, right?
Yeah.
Because I've seen some people, in in the street, or some tribes, very closed communities using, that minimum wage here, in France, and it starts, doing some problems, right? But of course, I can, I agree with you that, the meaning of purpose, the purpose of living, the meaning of life, it's a little bit too much like trendy talk, over the
I think it's important to keep in mind that
over the news and everything.
there are problems
But
that
just one thing,
UBI doesn't solve,
just
right?
one, just one thing. In the economy, basically what I would, and that's from scratch that I'm thinking, it's to provide the security. And security is what? Is food, access to water, infrastructures, and home, or an apartment or a place to live, education, and health. So if we were to have UBI, because this is the purpose of this talk, we could cover the security minimum wage.
Yeah,
You
I
would
think,
have people okay,
well, that's not what UBI is about, right? People obviously need food and shelter and a lot of other basic things. And we can have a debate about whether it makes sense for the market to allocate those things or whether it makes sense for the government to provide those things directly. UBI is for when you know you want to push money into the market, what's the most efficient way to do it, right? And that's the problem that it solves. There are plenty of problems, social problems, economic problems, all kinds of problems that UBI doesn't solve, right? And we shouldn't expect it to, right? It solves a very specific problem. And I think you're, bringing up important things about, you brought up the Sustainable Development Goals. UBI doesn't solve those. It certainly doesn't solve all of them, right? But UBI is nevertheless important because without it, the way we distribute money into the economy is broken.
That's why, for me, producing data that are, high quality, for the AI companies is, the market, from down to top, because with AIs, I've been working for the past 4 years in the way that I can invent econometrics, based on the SDGs and the 4Cs, from the UNESCO's. I am talking with these people right now, and I believe that, and it's not me that believe that, it's like the Open Water Society, PADI system work perfectly and self-sustain, self-finance its own operation based on the education. And I invented, the way to develop the digital universal education merged with the job development skills upskilling and reskilling on demand, apply to any kind of activities, which would help, to repurpose, to add a new stream of revenue for companies, global corporates on one side, and in the network society and the open digital society on the other side. It's about, creating new markets that leverage AI, because that's a force
Maud,
that is there.
we have a channel below for called Share Your Work, and if you do have something you're researching on, or a proposal, or new, or some sort of funding mechanism, I'd recommend you could post there. We can chat about it. We really have a really sort of specific emphasis. We really are talking about kind of the mechanics and the monetary theory of UBI, and that means we're really talking about markets and market efficiency and macroeconomic policy in a more sort of specific sense. So we're really talking about central banking and how monetary policy.
Value in order to be able to finance the UBI.
Yeah. So it basically the UBI is instead of easy monetary policy. So instead of having the private sector print our money for us, we print it directly. Obviously, the private sector is always going to be issuing some money, right? But more of that can be issued by the government, and you can have less private sector money issuance. So that's the trade-off. That's where you get the money from. You create less money in the private sector and create more money through the government.
All our money kind of comes from the monetary system. Ultimately, today we have a kind of, I think, according to our model, we might say we have a needlessly complicated financial system that we're using to create and issue money into markets. UBI is an alternative to that. It allows us to get to the goal of giving the market economy enough spending to work properly, but without over expanding the financial sector and the labor market in the process. We see UBI as like a simple, reliable, and efficient way to get money into the market economy, and it's an alternative to I think of a lot of different government policies we have today. Not primarily. Primarily, it's an alternative to what the central banks are doing now. So that's kind of the context where we're discussing UBI in.
Seems like an impossible, wicked problem.
Yeah, it's not an easy problem. If it were easy, we would have solved it a long time ago, huh?
Yeah, because it's.
I was
where
curious
to find the money.
Yeah, actually, that's sort of the key question, right? And we like to emphasize that where money comes from isn't different in UBI world than where it is today. I mean, Alex was just talking with Professor Steve Keenan, and one point of agreement they had was that money kind of comes from two general sources today. It comes from the government when they create money by spending more than they tax, and it comes from the private sector when the central banks lower interest rates, and that produces money, it creates money. So all our money comes from there. And Alex's model, he uses that to point out that if the government creates more money with the UBI, that can trade off against the money creation mechanisms in the private sector that the central bank kind of creates with their policies. So that's where the money comes from. It's the same place it's coming from today, just in a different amount. We'll have more money coming from the government and less money coming from expansionary monetary policy. So that's where the money comes from. And it's really not different. It's from exactly the same places that money comes from today.
Yeah. A question we can ask is, what level of universal basic income can the economy sustain without changing any taxes or anything like that, right? Maybe it's not very much, maybe it's a lot, but we can find out. And then later on, we can kind of take the step of saying, well, what if we introduced this and such tax or something like that? Would that change the level of UBI the economy can sustain, right? I think people who talk about UBI often skip this first step of like, what's the level of UBI that the economy can sustain right now without any taxes, right? And it's an important question, and it's the low-hanging fruit, right? Because you don't have to change anything except spend the UBI into the economy, and that would maybe imply tighter monetary policy. It's a little bit different in a place like France, where your central bank, you have your Bank of France, but you also have the ECB as the central bank for the Eurozone, right? And it's hard for one country in the Eurozone to implement a policy that would kind of balance off against the ECB or something like that. Like, what would happen to the sovereign debt of France if they tried to kind of deficit spend too much or something like that? I don't know how easy it would be to have a UBI in France without kind of balancing at least mostly against taxes or something like that. But certainly in countries where
The problem in France is that there is a big problem is that in France, if you move something on the other side, there's something else that moves. And, it's each time, we give to some people, we take off, from some others. And it's all the time, a big headache. Because plus the people are never agree, they don't agree. So it's about, all the time arguments and never actions in France. So
Yeah,
that's
so
why I left.
so that might mean that in a
You know,
place like
they-
France, the level of UBI the economy can sustain without introducing any new taxes is zero. Maybe it's zero, and then that's too bad. I think it's a little bit like that in the United States. Like if an individual state tried to implement a UBI, what level of UBI could be sustained in Massachusetts if Massachusetts didn't raise any more taxes, for example. And I don't know. It's tricky. If you're doing it at the level of the economy as a whole, at the level of the monetary authority, then the fiscal policy can trade off against the monetary policy. So that's mostly what we focus on.
Alex, I'm just curious. While I have you, was there anything else about the Steve Keen's show? I mean, was there any point brought up or question you brought up that you really wanted to talk about more, or that caused any questions? You raised any questions in your mind that you hadn't thought about?
Yeah.
That you didn't get.
I think it was Ty maybe who raised the point that, or maybe it was Steve, that we were talking about this a few minutes ago, I think, but that giving people the UBI would help them, but then raising the interest rates would hurt them again. So what are you even doing? And I think that's related to an important insight, which is that if you're giving people money one way, you don't have to give it to them the other way. And what is kind of the more efficient way to do it, and the one that's going to benefit them the most, right? So instead of having low interest rates, you can have basic income. And yes, the interest rates are higher under a basic income, but basic income is a better way of getting people money than low interest rates.
I think it's tough. I mean, if people are seeing a certain stance of interest rates as already natural or appropriate, right? I wanted to ask those questions about them. Like that's really what I was curious about, because I know that for Steve Keen and his fans, private they see private sector debt as being excessive. There's too much of it, and I was curious in their model, does that imply that interest rates are artificially low, or do they feel that rates are kind of where they're supposed to be, but nevertheless there's too much private debt anyway? Are they imagining like targeted policies, government policies that reduce private sector debt without affecting interest rates, or are they not really thinking about that? Like how do they model?
I think that's right. I think they're imagining that they want less private sector debt, but the way to do it is not through higher interest rates. And even Ty was saying that, when people have the basic income, they won't need to borrow as much. So they just won't, right? You don't need to raise interest rates. They just won't borrow as much, right? So he was trying to make that point. And I don't know. I think whenever it's profitable to borrow, people are going to borrow. Maybe not consumers, but like any financial institution or something like that. If you get cheap funding, you'll borrow and you'll lend it on and pick up a spread, right? So I think there's the idea that you only borrow when you need to or something like that is not correct. You borrow when it's profitable to borrow, and that's true, I think, of mostly of consumers too, right? Like sometimes you can choose whether you want to borrow to be able to do something, or spend the rest of your cash, or sell an asset in order to be able to buy. Like sometimes borrowing is often optional, right? And is it the most kind of profitable thing given the interest rates and other conditions in your life and that kind of thing?
What about borrowing to consume? Do people do that? I mean, borrowing so you can spend the money not on something that's going to make more money in the future necessarily, then it's not like profitable if you do it that way, right? But you might still do it.
Yeah, like you borrow to, well, it depends on how you frame it. Like, I guess borrowing to eat money, it's profitable in the sense that you're not dead, which is better than being dead.
Well,
But
you're paying
you
a
know,
cost. You're consuming more now. You're paying a cost for that later in the
right.
form of the
If you
interest.
borrow to buy a car, right? You're technically, you still have an asset, the car, but the car is probably going to depreciate faster than the amount you owe on the debt is going to go down. So that's going to take you into negative equity, as Steve Keen points out. I think, it's normal for consumers to go into negative equity too, at least with respect to kind of individual things. I mean, yeah, I don't think the government is that as different from everybody else as they make it out to be on that show.
Alex, in an offhand way, you mentioned you were talking about how this policy can be an alternative to expansionary monetary policy. You kind of sketched out, I thought, in a nice way about how different countries had been reacting to this problem in different ways. You talked about how interest rates were at or near zero for like 10 years, right? And it's interesting because we were expanding monetary policy presumably throughout that time without interest rates getting lower because they couldn't. They were at what was identified as a zero lower bound. So I guess is there any utility, do you think, for a concept of a UBI that can, when you're at the zero lower bound, or if you don't want to lower interest rates any further, the UBI can go up instead? Do you know what I mean? And is there that wouldn't necessarily, that might, but not necessarily would correspond to what we talk about as being the natural rate of basic income. But is there some? I was curious maybe why you didn't really talk about that. You really leaned into, well, no, this can be this in UBI where those higher interest rates, right? But it's also true that you'd have a lot of, if you're at the zero lower bound, you have a lot of monetary policy to unwind before you even get to the point where you're raising interest rates, right?
I think that's right. Yeah. And even if you're not at the zero lower bound, if it gets to the point where you want to start lowering interest rates again, you can just have UBI instead. Yeah. And they were someone commented that, using interest rates as a blunt instrument, and I think that's right. But they were also kind of assuming that zero was kind of the natural rate of interest, and that using interest rates as an instrument is the same thing as having higher interest rates. Whereas I would say using interest rates as an instrument would be lowering interest rates below what is kind of normal for the economy.
Yeah, and I also think that maybe is a good way of saying that to say that even when the natural rate of interest is zero, UBI can still be an efficient alternative to more expansionary monetary policy.
Normal is a problematic word because low interest rates are normal statistically right now. When you say normal, you mean like what they should be, really, if we weren't using jobs to get money to people, right?
Well, natural rate of interest is also a kind of a tricky term.
Same thing, right?
Because what does it mean? Typically what it means is the non-inflationary rate of interest, right? Or the non-accelerating inflation rate of interest. So, okay, well, that might be zero right now, but it wouldn't be zero. Basic income moves the natural rate of interest, right?
I guess when I say natural, I'm thinking usually in terms of both price stability and financial sector stability. We're achieving one of those today, but not the other.
I guess it's hard for me to imagine financial sector stability at an interest rate of zero.
Yeah.
That's why I don't bring it up.
I see.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
It feels like zero interest rate is inherently degenerate or problematic, right?
Would the people on that call have agreed with that? How much did they think? Would the people on the Steve Keen call?
No, I don't think so. I think they're kind of with the MMT that zero interest rates is optimal. But I would say that if you're borrowing and not paying for it, then something's going on. Something wrong is going on in the economy.
Right. You think that? I mean, they were saying that they believe the financial sector is overblown and overstimulated. They agreed with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you think that they would have a problem with zero interest rates, right?
If they want to restrict the financial sector using other mechanisms.
Yeah, and they don't want to necessarily. I'd assume that they are thinking, maybe at least before Alex's call today, they were thinking in terms of you'd like to solve that problem of the financial sector without reducing employment, right? Which is really different from saying employment should fluctuate just like interest rates should fluctuate. So I don't know. You'll have to ask them, Phil. We should email them and ask for follow-up questions.
Yeah, I guess this is a question. If I wanted to follow up with them, like I had them watch the mistake of full employment video beforehand, what should I have them look at afterwards?
The mistake of full employment video.
I still think the interview that Derek is the best one.
The first
Yeah,
one, the big one. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have that link handy? I have the actually I was going to repost that, just sort of like put it up without the intro and just be like, hey, this is reposted from 2018 or whatever. Do you want me to do that? And then I'll send you the link and you can share it to them?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, I'll do that. I'll do that today and you can share it tomorrow if that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Anything else kind of before we wrap up or switch to the other channel?
I think that's it.
Yeah, I'm done for tonight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mom,
Thanks for joining,
Mom.
Mom.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Nice chatting
Thanks,
with
Mom.
you. Hope to see you around in the future. Cool. Let's hop up to the lounge. I'll shut the stream down.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See ya.
And that causes prices to raise up to kind of just about where they were before. So the people who were living there before are paying the same prices they were paying before, but now they have a basic income on top of it, so they're a little bit richer. That